Spell bar. Today we're going to replace the combo box we are using to select the spell by a spell bar, because first it's going to be way nicer than selecting the spell we want to cast via a combo box, and because I realized that for all of our units we need to regenerate the spell bar according to all the spells that the unit type can cast, because not all the units are able to cast all the spells in the game. So since we have to do that, why not taking a bit more time just to make it nicer, and then we're gonna reuse that spell bar in the game, not just in the debug menu. So let's get to it. And the first thing we're gonna do in Unreal is to import all the textures we're gonna use today. So I'm gonna go in my art folder, in my texture folder, and create myself a new folder, which I'm gonna name spell icons. And inside that folder, I will import all the assets we have today. So all the icons that I have right here, I'm just going to drop them inside Unreal. Here we go, so here they are. Most of them are going to be available in the description, and some of them are just going to be for Patreon. So now we can go do the next step, which is to assign all those textures to our spells to select which texture we want to use per spell. So to do that, I'm gonna go in my blueprint core combat spell in utilities. Right here we have the spell data asset. We can open the structure and add ourselves a new variable for the texture. It is going to be of type texture 2D, and I named it icon. Now we can close the structure to go in the data table and assign all the textures to all of our spells. And to do that, it's pretty simple. I'm just going to start with the test spell. So I'm going to go in my icons here at the bottom and select an icon that I want to use. I'm going to use this one because it doesn't really matter. For the melee hit, I know that I have one specifically for the melee hit. So I'm just going to look for it. Here we go, melee hit right here. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. So sword slash, I know that I have a sword slash over there. But if you don't have it, because I think that I'm going to set those nice icons only on Patreon, you can use any of the other icons. It doesn't really matter. And you can do your own if you want to. So I'm just going to do that for all the other ones. Here we go, so now all my spell has its own icon and it's going to be nicer in the UI. So perfect, we can go create the UI now. And the first step is to create ourselves a new folder in the spell. So I'm gonna create myself a new folder right here. I'm gonna name it widgets, and we're gonna start by duplicating the widget we already created for the unit bar, the bar that we are using to select our units. We're gonna do the same thing but for the spell. So I'm gonna start by duplicating those since it's going to be pretty similar. So I'm gonna go in my widget, in my unit folder, unit widget, and I'm going to duplicate button unit first. So I'm gonna drag it inside the widget of the spell that we just created. So copy here. And just before opening the new widget, I'm just going to rename it first, so button underscore spell instead of button underscore unit, and now we can open it to do some modifications. So my modifications are done, and here they are. So first, for the border, I simply changed the padding right here in the top right corner to be 3 instead of 5, and then I went inside the appearance brush to change the draw as, and I've set it to an image instead of a box. Then for the button, the first thing I did is first renaming the button, so now it's button underscore spell instead of button underscore unit, and then I went on the right and in my appearance style in all the states of my button, so normal, over, the pressed and everything, I just changed it to make sure that it is draw as an image also, so not a box either. So draw as image for the normal, draw as image for the hovered, image for the pressed, and then image for the disable. And I've also changed another thing is the background color right here. I've just made it a little bit lighter because the unit button is a little bit dark in my opinion, so I want to have a little something a little bit lighter than the button for the units for our spells. And the last one is the image. So first I renamed it, so it's image underscore spell icon. Then I went in the padding right here in the top right to make it a 0 padding and horizontal and vertical alignment to stretch to both sides, just like that. And then in the appearance, I changed the image size to be 50 by 50, just so we have a better preview in the viewport right here. When the drop down right here is set to desired, it gives us a better preview of what it's going to look in game with the size of 50 by 50. And then I've changed the draw to be an image also, so everything is an image now. And now since my texture is a little bit smaller than what I want it to be, I just went in the render transform in the scale and I've added a little bit of scale. So now the scale is 1.05 for both the X and the Y, just so it's a little bit bigger. And now we're done with the designer, so we can go work on the graph. And the first thing I'm gonna do, since I want this blueprint to compile, is to change my event dispatcher. I'm gonna change the variable type from button unit to button spell, which is the widget we are in right now, so button spell right here. And now if we compile, everything should work perfect. And now when we were using this button for the units, we had a little feature right here that was letting us decide if we wanted the unit to look left or right, but we're not gonna use it for the spells because the spells are not gonna look left or right. So I'm just going to delete this part right there. And I'm also going to delete the variable on the left. So is looking right, we're not gonna use it, so delete it. Then here we were using the unit type to decide which icon we want to display on the button, but in this case it's going to be a spell and not a unit type, so I'm gonna go in my variable on the left here and change the variable type for eSpell instead of eUnit type, so change variable type, and I'm also going to rename the variable to spell. Here we go. And now if we compile, we have a few errors because it's still trying to fetch the data from the unit type, but now it is supposed to use the unit, the spell data instead. So what I'm going to do is just delete these three nodes right here, and I'm also going to right click on the variable and refresh just so it has the right name written on it. Now we can compile and it should not complain anymore. And now to reconnect everything, we're gonna use the get spell data from spell right here, and then we can break the structure to access the icon that we want to display. And we're also just going to reconnect the event at the end right here, just like that. So now we're done with the graph. We can compile and go see how it looks in the designer now. Oh, actually, before we do that, I forgot something in the graph right here. I forgot to rename my event dispatcher. So I'm just going to rename it unspell button clicked instead of ununit button click. Now we can compile and go in the designer for real. And now here we can see that it is just a white square and it doesn't seem to work, but this is just because if we select the button spell on the left right here, we have access to all the variables in the top right corner. The default spell is set to none, which doesn't have any icon associated to it. So now if we change it to, let's say, test spell or throat throw or any other spell, we should now be able to see all the icons displayed on the icon on the button. And now we can check and uncheck the selected checkbox to see how it looks with a border and without it. Here we go. So now it seems to work. I'm just going to restore it to the default variable. So none n is selected. And now I'm just going to compile, save it, and we can close the button because we're done with it. And now for the spell bar, we could either duplicate the one that was already done for the units and modify it, but I think we're going to change two things. So what I'm going to do is just create it from scratch. So I'm just going to create myself a new user interface, button list underscore spells, and then we can open it. And here we first have the designer side of things, which I just added two new components. So I have my scale box right here. So it is a scale box, and I've changed the stretch to scale to fit X and the stretch direction to down only right here in top right corner. And then inside the scale box, I have a grid panel, which I named the grid panel underscore spells because it is a variable. So I made it is variable in the top right corner right here. And then I've changed the padding, the slot alignment, horizontal and vertical alignment to be stretched on both sides and aligned on top only. Here we go, just like that. Now we can go inside the graph. And here we're not going to use either the construct or the tick, so we can delete both of those. And I'm going to start by creating myself a new function to decide which spells I want to add in the spell bar. So for the name, I named it the set spells list because we're gonna use it to set the spells that we want to display in the spell bar right here. And I've also added an input variable that I named spells, and it is an array of e-spells. Then with that array of e-spells, I created myself a new variable right here, a spells list inside the widget itself. So right here I have my spells list, which is also an array of e-spells, and I've made it instance editable. That way we are going to be able to change it in the designer and have a preview directly. So that's why it is instance editable right here. And then what I did is taking the spells that we receive as input and use it to set the spells list inside the widget. And now that this function is created, what I also did is going back in the event graph right here to call the set spells list function. We are using the spells list variable that we have right here. So we are just going to refresh the spell bar using the spell list that we are setting in the designer or anywhere else. So we are taking the variable, setting it inside the function, and now we have to do the logic that will display the spells in the spell bar. And here how's the logic's gonna go. So first we have to clear the children of the grid panel spell because the previous iteration we added some children in it, we added some spells in the spell bar, we want to clear them. So let's clear them first. So now we have an empty spell bar to work with. The first step to do after that is to check and make sure that the spell list is not empty, because if it is empty, well, instead of using the spell list, we're gonna loop through all the spells in the game. So right here, that's what I'm doing. So if it's false, if there's nothing in the list, I'm just going to add a simple debug feature right here to let us populate the spell bar with all the spells we have in the project, just so we are going to be able to test all the spells at the same time. But if there's something in the spell list, let's say you selected a unit and that unit has some specific spells associated to it, and we want to display only those spells, well, that's what we're doing right here. We're gonna iterate through that list instead of iterating through all the spells in the project. And then what I'm doing is just setting myself a variable. So I have a new local variable that I created myself right here. So my variable for the spell, and I'm using that variable to remember which button I want to create. So that's what I'm doing right here. And then the next step is to actually create the button. But before we do that, we just want to make sure that the spell we are trying to create is not equal to none, because a none spell is not really a spell in our case. We don't have a spell associated to that variable type, variable value, I mean. So we're just gonna make sure that it is not equal to none. And if it is not equal to none, well, now it's time to create the button for real. So I'm doing a create a widget right here, selecting my class button spell because it's the class of the button we want to create. And then we can pass it the spell just so it has the right visual on it. I'm not gonna make it selected. We're gonna do that a little bit later. But what I'm doing is setting it inside a variable. So I have a new local variable right here, a variable that I named the button, which is the spell button that we just created, because we're gonna do a few extra steps on top of the button, so it's going to be a little bit cleaner if it is inside a variable. And in those steps, the first step is to add it inside the grid panel, because we have a grid panel, we have a button, let's put the button inside the grid panel. So that's what I'm doing right here. So inside my grid panel spell, I'm doing add a child to grid, which is the button. So the button is the new child. And for the row and columns, for now, I'm just going to keep it simple so we have a visual in the designer. But we're going to fix that in 2 minutes. We're going to improve it and have them stacked over multiple rows if we have too many spells. But for now, let's just make it on one row. So I'm just going to get the child count of my grid panel to determine which column I want to use for the new button. And now that all my buttons are inside my grid, so all of them are stacked right beside each other, we have to handle the click event. So that's what I'm doing right here. So the event on a spell button click. So every time we are clicking on a new spell, we want to select it. And to do that, we need more code. So to do that, I'm going to bind myself to the callback and create the associated event. So right here, create event. Right now it complains because the event doesn't exist. So I'm just going to create a matching event just like that. And it is going to create it. Okay, it created it inside my function. That's weird. This should be inside the event graph. So I'm just going to move it in the event graph instead. Now I can compile. Okay, that works. I'm just going to also rename the event. Instead of custom event 0, I'm going to rename it on spell button clicked. Here we go. Now I can compile. Et voila. Now that's good. It works. It's perfect. So now I can go back right here and see and make sure that it is still associated. Here we go. It is. So great. We now have all our button spawn created and added to the grid, and they are now supporting the unclicked event. And now, just before we go back in the designer and see the result, there's one last little thing I want to change, and it is to make sure that the first button in the button bar is selected. It doesn't mean that that's what we want to have for the final game, but for now I think it makes sense for the debug menu. So for now, I'm just going to select the first spell in the button list. So to do that, what I'm going to do is just first do a do once, which means that it is only going to be executed on the first button that is created, because we are in a for each loop. And this is going to be executed only once, so on the first iteration of the for each loop. And then inside the do once, what I'm doing is just a set is selected on the button, so I'm selecting it, and then I'm simply calling the onSpell button clicked event callback. So now we know that the button was clicked and we can react accordingly. So if we want to display the spell range, well, we are going to display the spell range, so that's exactly what we want. Good. Now we can go back in the designer to see the result. And here it is. So I have my spell bar, which is displaying all the spells that we have in the game right now. So I have my default spell, and then the arrow one, the sword ones, and all the other ones. And it is because the spell list is currently empty. If you select the button list on the left right here, we can see that the spell list in the top right corner, the default variable is empty. So that's why it is spawning all the spells that we have in the project. But if we start adding some elements inside the spell list, so let's say I'm going to add it and select let's say melee hit, it's going to add a melee hit. Then I can add a new one, so let's say short range arrow, and then I can maybe select the slime ball. So now I have multiple spells, only 3 spells in my spell bar depending on the list that I'm feeling it. So if I want a 4th one, I can add a 4th one if I want to, and only the first spell is selected by default. So if I rearrange my array, we can see that it is always selecting the first spell by default. There we go. So that's how the spell list works for now, so that's good. We can clear the spell list right here. And what we're gonna do now is just to make sure that we have the possibility to create multiple rows of spell, because right now it's only on one row. So if we end up with, let's say 100 spell in our game right now, it won't really work. We're gonna have way too many spell on one little line. So that's why we're gonna add the possibility to have multiple rows. So let's go back in the graph to do that. And I'm going to create myself a new variable. So new variable right here. I'm going to name it buttons quantity per row right there. I'm going to open the little eye icon to make it instance editable. And it is going to be of type integer, because it's going to be a number. The number we want to have by default, let's say 6. We want to have 6 buttons per row. I think it makes sense. So we have 6 spell, next row, 6 spell, next row. I think that makes sense. So this is going to be the default value. And what we're going to do is move a little bit on the left right here to add the logic right there, just before the add child to grid function, because we're going to set the row and the column. So we can move this right here and disconnect it for now. And that's how it looks. So first we are getting the children count, and we are dividing it by the button quantities per row, which telling us how many rows we already completed. So we can plug that result inside the row. And then for the column, it's pretty much the same thing, but we are using a modulo instead. So using the children count modulo the button quantity per row, it's going to tell us how many button is left to place in the row before going to the next row. So that's why we are using the modulo for the column, and that's going to populate a nice grid. And here in between, I've added a max node just to make sure that the button quantity per row cannot be lower than 1, because first, it doesn't make sense to have 0 button per row or -5 button per row. It will not make sense at all. And also because if we want to try to divide by 0, the divide right here is going to break, and the modulo is going to break also. So this is just preventing user error in the case that the user didn't set any values in that variable right here. So that variable will be set to 0 by default, and that will cause a bunch of issues. So that's why right here I'm clamping it to 1. So we have minimum 1 button per row, and that just makes sense. And now we can go see in the designer how it looks. So first, oh yeah, already we have 2 rows of 6 buttons, so that's great. We can see that it works. And now if we change the button quantity per row, so let's say put it to 4, or let's say I'm just going to go that way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oops, I wrote bigger than 9, so 9, 10, 11. So we can see that it works. We now have as many rows of button as we want. Great, so that works. So that's done. We can go back in the graph to finish this button list. And there's actually one last thing I want to do inside this function, and it is to make sure that we're not regenerating the list, the button bar, for no reason. So if the list that we receive as input is the same as the previous time that function was called, well, we don't want to regenerate the spell bar because it's the same spell bar. So let's not regenerate it for no reason. So what I'm gonna do is go back at the beginning of the function right here, and before setting the spell list and doing everything else, I'm just going to add myself a new comparison right here. So a new branch that will let us compare if the spell list that we receive as input, so the spell list that we have right here, is equal or not to the spell list that we currently have, so the one that we set right there. So if they are equal, not. So if they are not equal with each other, it means that they are different, so we can regenerate the whole thing because both lists are not the same. And then since we want to also use this function in the construction script and we want it to work with the spell list that we set in the editor, I'm just going to have to add a new force input right here in the function. So I'm adding a new boolean, a force, which I'm plugging it to a or, so that we, if we want to force the regeneration of the list, even though the two lists are the same, well, we are still going to be able to do it. So that's mainly for the construction script, but if we want to do it on construct everywhere else, force or whatever. If we want to regenerate the list for some reason, well, we'll be able to do it with the force parameter. And now we can go in the graph just to check the little checkbox in the pre-constrict. So now if we compile, we should be able to just go see in the designer that nothing changed. We are now able to regenerate the list, no problem. Great, so that's done. Now we can focus on the onSpell button clicked function. And here, before doing the logic, I'm actually going to create two things. First, we need a new variable for the button that is currently selected. So I'm going to right click on the button, promote to variable, and name it selected button. Here we go. Now the variable is created. I can just delete it because we're going to replace it somewhere else later on. And then I'm going to create myself a new event dispatcher. I named it unselected spell button change, and I'm going to add a new input for the spell button. So I'm just going to name it button first, and for the variable it's going to be spell button. Here we go, button spell that we have right there. We now have both the new selected button variable and the new event dispatcher. And that's how the code is going to look. You're gonna see it has a bunch of nodes, and that's just a part of it. And we're gonna go step by step just so it's simpler for you. So here I have my sequence at the beginning. We're gonna use that a little bit later. For now, you can just have it right there. It's nice, it's pretty, it doesn't do anything, it's right there. Good. Then we want to check to see if the selected button, the button that is already selected right now, is the same as the button we just clicked on it. Because if we just clicked on the same button as the one that is already selected, well, we want to deselect the button. We don't want to do anything else special. Maybe in your case, you don't want to deselect that button. We can change that behavior later on. But for now, I just want to deselect the button in the case that I click on the button that is already selected. So that's what I'm doing right here. If the buttons are the same, we just want to make sure that the selected button is already valid. If it's not, well, it means that it's already deselected, so it should not be the case, but whatever. Let's have is valid right here just to make sure that it doesn't cause any errors in the future. And then we can deselect the button and set the variable to null. So here we are deselecting the button because it was already selected. And that's for when we are clicking on a button that is already selected. But what if we are clicking on a new button? Well, that's what happens. Right here, if we just clicked on a button that is not selected, so it's not equal to the selected button right here, it's going to be false, and it's going to go to that sequence. But in this case, well, we still want to go back up. We still want to deselect the previous button that was selected. So that's what we're doing. We are clicking on a new button. Before selecting the new button, well, we're going to deselect the previous one. So that's what we're doing right here. We're deselecting the button, setting the variable to null. Perfect. And then we can continue the sequence and go at the bottom right here. So here we are setting the new selected button, which we received as input. So here we go. We are setting it. And then we can simply make sure that the button is valid before selecting it. So here it is. I'm selecting the button right here. So if we clicked on a new button, we deselect the previous one, and then we select the new one. And now the last little thing we have to do is to call the callback that we created at the beginning, because we're not calling it anywhere. And that's why we have the sequence right here at the beginning, because we're going to do that. We're going to do the old logic right here, the select, deselect, anything, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter. We are going to do all that code right there that does everything that needs to be done when we are clicking on a new button. And then once everything is done, well, we are just going to call the callback to notify everyone else, hey, okay, the button was changed. Oh, actually, just before going to the next step, I think it would be a good idea to have another function that lets us obtain the spell that is currently selected. So what I'm going to do is create myself a new function, which I'm going to name get the selected spell. And I'm going to make it pure, and here is the logic. So it's super simple. We are getting the selected button, checking if it is valid, and if it's true, well, we can simply return the spell that is saved inside the button. Otherwise, we can return none at the end. That way, every time we want to access the selected spell, it's going to be simpler. We just have to call this new function. Perfect. And that's it for this widget. We can now compile and close it, and the last step we have to do is to use it. And the place we are going to use that new component is inside the button action cast spell. So here in the debug menu in our action, we have the button action cast spell that if we open, we can see that we were using a combo box to select which spell we want to cast. But instead of using that combo box, because it's not pretty and that's just some text, it's not interesting. So we're going to replace it with our new widget that we just created. So to do that, I'm just going to first delete the combo box. We don't need it anymore, and take my button list spell and drop it inside the action widget. Here we go. Now we can just make sure it is a variable. We can set it a little bit of padding, so let's say 2, just so it's a little bit smaller than the button itself. And now the spell list is fine like that, and we can go in the graph. And here if we compile, we can see that we now have a few errors, so let's see what we can do to fix them. And since the first problem is right here, we're gonna start by that one. So instead of fetching from the combo box which spell is selected, we're gonna use the button list spell instead. So we can just use it to reconnect both the function. And now we can delete that bit of code because we don't need it anymore. Then if we check the next error that we have, so I'm just going to click on it. Okay, so here it is. We are trying to set the visibility of the combo box, but it doesn't exist anymore. So I'm just going to replace that by the button list spell instead, just like that. Then if we compile and click on the next error, it is going to bring us to the pre-construct, which is still trying to populate the combo box. So we don't need to do that anymore. So let's just delete all that. Now we should be able to compile, and here we go. We don't have any error left. The last thing we have to do though is to implement the event that is called every time we are selecting a new button. So the callback inside the button list. So what I'm going to do is just select my button list spell on the left and implement the event with the plus button right here. So it's going to create the event for us right there. Event that I'm just going to move and replace the unselection change combo box here that we don't use anymore. So we can just delete that one and replace it with the new one. Here we go. So I think we're done with this action now. We can compile, and actually I think we can close it. Great. And actually, I think we are ready to test in the game to see how it looks. So I'm gonna go in my spells right here and select my action. And we can see that we now have all the buttons for our spell, and we can select any action that we want. And then if I click on the grid, if I select any other action, it should update the range, and it works. And then if I do a right click on the grid, it should cast the appropriate spell. Great, so it seems to work perfectly. Good. There's just one last thing though that I want to change before ending the video, and it is here, the size of my tab right here. We can see that when we select this action, it expands really big, and that's way too big, and I don't think that's good. We should probably limit the width of the tab, so it's a little bit more like all the other ones. The other ones are way smaller than that one, so that one will be like way too big, I think. So we can probably just limit the size of that tab, and it's going to look way nicer. So let's do that just real quick before ending the video. And that's gonna be inside the tabs in the tab spell. So let's open that one. And actually the fix is going to be super simple. What I'm gonna do is go in my hierarchy here on the left and right click on the vertical box, which is the root of my widget. So right click on it, do a wrap width, and choose a size box. And we don't see any difference, and it is because we didn't set any value in the size box. So I'm just going to select it, go in the top right corner and do a width override, and the value I'm gonna use is 300. Actually, you can use the value that you want. If you want it to be smaller or bigger, you can tweak that value as you wish, but I think that 300 makes sense for now. So I'm just going to leave it as is, and then I'm gonna save, close everything, and go test to see how it looks in game now. And here we go. So now every time we are selecting the button, it doesn't affect the size of the window. So that's pretty good. It's pretty stable. It looks more stable. So that's great. And the width of that tab is pretty much the same as the one for the grid. So that's good too. So both of them are pretty similar. And I think it's perfect like that. So good. Now we can select the spell that we want and cast it. And that's pretty much it for today. This time it's true. In the next video, we're going to make that the units are able to cast spell on other units and be affected by them. But for now, that's good enough for today. So I'm gonna see you in the next one. So bye bye.